Later in the video, I'm going to be talking about these divergences on the RSIs in the 60-minute time frame. Possible divergences could form. Talking about the topping tails because we got the 9 counts. We had these 9 counts form yesterday. Again, times you go a little higher and then you turn. Other times you turn immediately. So far we're going a little higher. Maybe we're not done. We still have that upper resistance on the channel, but we did get some topping tails today. We'll see what becomes of it. We'll see if we get confirmation and a follow through. We have rising wedges, but we are getting these 9 count signals and may just give us a pullback and a trend extension up to go higher, get the divergences on the 60-minute charts. It might lead to a reversal sooner rather than later. But keep in mind, as we're getting the 9 counts, we got it on the Dow, the NASDAQ, and the S&P right here. Keep in mind, this week we are getting a 13 count down sell signal on the S&P 500. We had the 9 count. We formed a 9-9 signal. This 9 gave us a pullback. This count, we went a little bit higher, and then we ended up turning after going a little bit higher and overthrowing that level. That's often the way it is. The NASDAQ, it went just a little bit higher. S&P went a little bit more higher. Here we went just a little bit higher, and then we turned. Sometimes you do that, and you go count. So maybe we do that with a 13. We go a little higher after this week's SPAR, or maybe 2022 and 2020, where we go up here, make a peak, and we're very close to that high next week. And again, that's why I'm watching the upper boundary of those channels in the weekly time frame. For the Dow and the S&P, they're very close. NASDAQ might reach it with NVIDIA earnings next week. If we go higher next week, we might overthrow the 13 count a little bit, but it's just something we're paying attention to. Again, when we moved above the January 2022 high, we had the peak moving higher for 2 weeks, and that second week we got the reversal. And very similar to that, I think it was the third week, we got the reversal after 2 weeks of testing the highs in 2020. I'll be showing you that in this video. S&P was down today, but so was the VIX. Again, getting a little spinning top candlestick. Again, it broke out, it back tested. I'll be watching to see if the VIX tries to rebound back above the 50-day moving average in the coming days ahead. If it does, again, if we get a topping process and we get back above the 50-day, then again, we'll be watching to see if the S&P starts to break down, dropping below its 50-day and taking out the rising trend line. If we get a reversal off of the upper channel lines that I've been talking about. So again, we might reach that level with NVIDIA week. We might do it this week, watching those upper channel lines that I've been talking about. Please support the channel with the link directly below that allows us to be able to provide you this information. You can take a moment to do that. I would really appreciate it. Follow the link below and it will take you to a secured site. You can donate any amount you want. I don't have sponsors because I don't want to sell you stuff, so I just ask that you do what you can to help out, but I do need your help in order to make it work, so please consider doing that today. Thank you for that. We saw momentum turn on April 26th here on the S&P 500, and that was after we had the test of the 20-week moving average in the weekly time frame. We bounced, pulled back a couple times, then we got the back-to-back bullish candlesticks. We got back above the 10 period, able to hold above the 10 period, filled the gap, consolidated, got consolidation, and kept going. In order for a turn to drop below the 10 period moving average, get a bearish reversal of conditions, start seeing the red bars. After momentum turned on April 26, we began to see the swing signals begin to turn back to bullish. You form the divergence in the weekly time frame that marks a reversal. We'd have to see everything turn back to bearish. We do pull back here further. I'll be watching the 10 period moving average currently at 52.19. Same thing for the NASDAQ. Again, we have the 20 below the 50. Again, when we get the 20 back above it, if we do here, again, could be suggesting a topping process with the moving averages just crisscrossing back and forth. P has the 20 just below the 50. If we get a bullish realignment of the moving averages and the rally fails because of a negative divergence forming on the weekly chart, I'll be watching to see if we lose those moving averages and if everything reverts back to bearish. Crisscrossing back and forth of the moving averages is suggesting a possible topping process. S&P daily here again. Now, it could be that don't get the 20 back above the 50, but we're very, very close to doing it here. This is the S&P daily again. And as I've said, again, momentum is still not validating this thing. And again, we got a lower high over here, never did get that 20 back above it. Now we're moving to a higher high here, but the 20 is still below. Even if we get it, it might suggest a topping process. We might see a bullish of the 20 and the 50, and then it might immediately fail. right here, it's interesting. We're above the 50 and momentum is still negative at this point. That's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to have it. If this is the real deal, a fake, phony, baloney, plastic, banana, good time, rock and roll, fake rally, we're supposed to go in positive territory and stay there. Now, we could go into positive territory and get a lower high still, and again, go up to the levels I'm talking about. We can see that happen and still form a larger divergence between the two peaks. Well, we had the Dow reach 40,000 today. I told you that was likely going to be the case. And again, the celebration happens. S&P reached 5,300 now, 40,000. Major resistance. I went through this in great length and detail in yesterday's update. I wanted to show you here again, we had little diversions on the Dow right here with this peak right here. And it really just gave us this pullback and it's formed this trend line. We have now a possible rising wedge here in play. Still see a divergence form in the most recent price action as the Dow and the S&P are pulling back towards the trend lines of the rising wedge. S&P did get a topping tail today, so it's always possible that could be it. But my guess is we're going to form a divergence on the 60-minute chart of the S&P. Again, wanted to continue to point out, again, back here at the lows, the S&P hit the 20-week moving average and the Dow bottomed out. We had a push higher and then a pullback. I talked about, we got the bullish, back-to-back bullish candlesticks on the daily time frame here. I talked about all the gaps on the Dow, and I told you these gaps some of them can fill or all of them can fill depending on if we try to make a new high and go up to the upper channel lines or whether we just go back and lower high scenario and back up to 5,200 on the S&P and overthrow it, get a lower high and then turn down. But I've been talking about this. We filled the gaps. The Dow's now moving higher. A potential rising wedge, probably going to form another reference point of a divergence, goes up and tries to hit that upper channel line. This week we have NVIDIA earnings. We'll be watching that. Keep in mind the Dow did get a topping tail today, so did the S&P 500. So it is possible that we don't reach that level if we start a reversal process. But went up, we rallied, the 40,000 level pulled back. Could be we're getting a pullback and then we go up and get one more push higher into that weekly resistance that I've been talking about on the Dow and the S&P 500. NASDAQ's a little bit further away from it, tries to reach it with the NVIDIA earnings. Maybe it doesn't reach it at all. We'll see. But again, we talked about these back-to-back bullish candlesticks back over here. We talked over here about the possibility of a bottom as the S&P reached the 20-week moving average. It's very possible. That's 4 weeks ago from tomorrow. And I told you that's very possible the S&P has put in a bottom and we go back up, we get a lower high scenario or a higher high scenario after we had these double top patterns form. And this is the Dow right here. So topping tail here, we'll see what becomes of it. And candlesticks have to be confirmed and get a follow through to mean anything. And maybe the candlestick just gives us a little bit of a pullback. Maybe it starts a reversal. We did get the 9-count sell signals yesterday on the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, as I talked about in great length and detail. Price exhaustion. Showing you the Dow because the Dow reached 40,000 a day, and financial media celebrating, on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, they whip out the 40,000 hats and all the rest of it and put on the party hats and throw confetti and all the rest of it. So again, I'll be watching to see what becomes of this candle. We did get a topping tail today on the Dow, on the S&P 500. Watching to see how we close the week out. Again, I'm looking for these divergences to complete. We already had one on the Dow over here that gave us this sell-off. Okay, now the Dow's moving slightly higher to the upper end of the channel here. Again, we're turning right now, we're stalling, I should say, right at this trend line from the peak over here. Now again, if you look at this carefully. We had a peak over here in 2021. We sold off, we rebounded, and we came up here in January, and we moved slightly higher there in the last week, I think it was of December, and couldn't close above that peak. And then we made another attempt to do it, and we went a little bit higher, and we got a topping tail. But we had a shooting star, we had a topping tail in both of those cases. This one, though, wasn't as big as this one, and this one gave us a gravestone type of a doji looking candlestick. Maybe a sloppy shooting star, again, with the smaller real body. You can clearly see the topping tail, but we went up for about 2 weeks and flirted with new highs, and then we turned. And, the S&P had dropped about that 15% or so at that reversal. I think that we could see something very similar to that here. But again, I'm watching these two trend lines. Here, I told you I expected the Dow to reach the 40,000 level and come up here to one of these trend lines where I think it's going to peak. And maybe by the end of the week, this week or next week, maybe we see that happen. We believe that the divergences are going to create a likelihood a top. Again, I've been talking about this chart for months now, and I was looking for a divergence for a lower high long before we ever hit the 20-week. I told you it's possible we just, plow on through the 20-week and get a bigger drop, but I told you there's a very strong possibility that we bottomed out at the 20-week moving average, and I told you that 4 weeks ago. Tomorrow will be 4 weeks since we hit that low. But there are 5 bars because we hit it on the Friday of that final weekly red bar there. As we were topping before that I was looking for a top to develop, and I told you the top was going to either develop like this where we get a peak and we start seeing a big sell-off. There's just no looking back, and we just start plowing through the 20-week. The other thing I told you was that we get a peak, we come down and we get a lower high, and then we fill that gap at 5,200, and then we drop down and we take out the 20-week and we start getting the bigger sell-off with a lower high scenario, which is what we've talked about over here for the July peak of 2023. Then the other possibility I told you about is the peak where we formed a peak, bounced off a 20-week moving average. As we've talked about over here, what happened with this top? We bounced off the 20-week moving average, went back up, made a slightly higher high, and then that was it. Here we moved back towards the 20-week moving average, but we rebounded back up, again, made a slightly higher high, and then we had the crash there with the pandemic. Here we moved to the 20-week, we bounced, we made the lower high. I've talked about this at great length of detail and showing you this chart right here before we ever hit the 20-week moving average, but even back up at the top, I was talking about the topping process. And again, the one that we're currently in right now is where we go to make a higher high, but then we turn back down. And then there's the possibility of a double top or head and shoulders pattern beginning to form. And again, getting that divergence here. Complacency has now returned, or saying what they were saying back, at the March top, that there's no way this market's going to go down. New bull market. We're going to continue to rise until 2027. We're going to have this soft landing out of the Fed. Inflation's not a threat. And now we have the inflation in line or slightly better with the CPI. So inflation's no longer a threat anymore. Banking crisis is over. And again, the same talking points been saying again since the October low that the pause is bullish for the market, and that's why I'm looking for a topping process. The pivot is bearish for the market and will likely produce a peak with the Fed pivoting or before the Fed pivoting. Talked about at great length and detail. It is a bearish event, and likely top is going to form ahead of the Fed pivot. Now again, it's been hovering now between one or two cuts to no cuts. Now, again, it's back with cuts being back on the table now, 2024. But again, this channel is going to play out. And again, let me just bring it up real close here. Look at this over here. Again, I'm bringing this up close because I want you to see this. We went slightly higher, and the Dow didn't close above that previous peak. The S&P did, and then it got a little tiny topping tail, and then the next week it tested those levels. And then it ended up reversing by that week. And again, we'll get the NVIDIA earnings next week. Is what I'm looking for is that if we form a divergence on the 60-minute chart, we could still reach this level either this week or next week, maybe both. Like here, we went back up and tested the highs, 2 weeks in a row, but ended up reversing by the end of the week for the second week, dropping 15%. Back below the 20-week moving average. Look where the 20-week moving average is. It's rising. But I told you, again, we bounced off the 20-week when we hit it nearly 4 weeks ago. We did get the divergence scenario, and I told you I didn't know if we get a lower high filling the gap or coming back up here and hitting the upper boundary. We'd likely see this divergence develop. So, and price would likely peak at this trend line right here. Nobody thinks that's possible right now. Back in 2022, again, when we bounced and we hit it, and remember, we were slamming right into weekly resistance right there. Here we're going to be slamming right into this trend line at weekly resistance. Some other trend lines I went into great length of detail showing you those trend lines in the video yesterday. See it, go back and watch it. I showed the weekly and the monthly charts. I'll briefly show you trend line from 2007. Again, we're right below it. It's at this very same place. The weekly trend line is from the upper boundary of our channel in the more recent price action. But again, there's a confluence of resistance directly overhead. Quickly, here's that monthly trend line of resistance from the 2000 top. Again, this is the log scaling and it's directly overhead. I think you're going to hit these levels. I think you're probably going to see the divergence develop on the 60-minute chart. Now, again, keep in mind, we do have a topping tail. If we get confirmation, and a follow through, then it can act as a turn, but I still think you've got a shot at hitting the trend lines from 2007, 2000, and the upper boundary of the channel here are more recent action, and this longer term. But you've got the multiple point divergence in the monthly time frame. I think you're forming one right here in the most recent price action, very similar to what we had over here at this top right here. And again, I think that once that completes, we're going to turn, and it'll probably complete at just a little bit higher levels there on the S&P in all likelihood. I guarantee we reach that level, but it is a strong possibility if a divergence develops on the S&P 500 60-minute chart. If the S&P can inch a little bit higher here and hit this level this week or next week, or maybe both like we did back over here, we went a little bit above, testing the highs for 2 weeks in a row, very close to one another, both of those highs in late 2021 and early 2022. We peaked like the 4th or 5th day or something like that of January. So you had the last week of December and the first week of January there of 2022 and late 2021. I think you could see something like that here because, again, also in 2020, when we moved above the high, there were just 2 bars that moved above the high. We peaked, after 2 bars being above that level and then began to reverse hard. I think you could see something very similar to that. As we get this topping tail and the Dow, let me bring up the S&P. Here it is on the S&P. As we get this topping tail, we had the RSI reach extremes on the 60-minute chart. Yesterday, we're probably going to see some kind of pullback and a divergence develop. So I think you're going to see something like this. We do have a trend line now right there. And, we can come here, hit this level maybe, and then turn back up. And if we do form the divergence on the 60-minute chart, we can slam right up into that upper channel line that I've been showing you on the weekly chart. I talked about 2.5 weeks ago, we had back-to-back bullish candlesticks, a higher low, and again, I told you that we could possibly have a bottom at that 20-week moving average. I told you I was looking, do we go up and try to fill the gap, at least hit the 200 period on the 60-minute chart, or do we go try to make a new high? We ended up trying to make a new high. We talked about all 3 of those scenarios. But if we make a new high, watch the upper boundary on the channel. I'm showing you that chart for months now. The S&P ended up down 11 points, down 2.1%, so just over 0.2%. The topping tail in the daily time frame starts playing out. We start breaking the trend line. We start seeing things reverse. Then, again, maybe we don't reach that level. My guess is we're probably going to reach that level. If we come back a little bit further, we can still hit the trend line and rebound back up here and reach that level, and then end up trying to break down from a rising wedge pattern, a bear flag pattern. We moved above the upper boundaries. We've now evolved into a larger rising wedge pattern here on the S&P 60-minute chart. Look at the RSI. I told you again yesterday. Again, very good chance we're going to get some kind of pullback. We saw it at extremes. That's now happening. Okay. And maybe we come back deeper. Maybe the trend line changes. We come back to the gap fill or gap support here, and the trend line changes. Trend lines change all the time. Or maybe we bounce off the trend line that is currently in place. But I'm going to be watching. Do we get confirmation of a lower high next, or do we get confirmation of a divergence, one or the other? Lower high, something like that, okay? Or do we go up and make a new high, hitting the upper boundary of the channel and then turn? But I think you can get something like that, and then I think that be a reversal. As I've said, again, I'm looking for a reversal because I know that is going to pivot, and I know that when they do, the stock market will likely peak before that happens or peak with that happening. We'll be watching pullback. We had the RSI at extremes, momentum was at extremes. We're now seeing this. Again, pretty good chance we can get a divergence on the RSI. Again, we have the trend line here. We have the 20 period moving average on the 60-minute chart. We have the cloud here. We lost the momentum line there, but you have the momentum cloud. You've got the 20 period moving average. Even if we go lower, again, to try to go to gap support or the gap fill, you've got your 50 period down here. You got your gap fill down here. So again, the trend line, while it may change, I still think you got a pretty good chance you're going to form a divergence and just pull back to the trend line here and bounce and then begin to turn back up. Will we see a sell-off with NVIDIA, or maybe we get a top with NVIDIA and then a sell-off with it? That's a catalyst for a top or a sell-off, one or the other. Maybe it's some other catalyst. Well, a banking crisis is coming, so that's still on the radar. I'm going to be watching right now. We've been finding support at the momentum cloud and 20 period moving average here on the 60-minute chart. Watching to see if we bounce off these levels yet again, and if we do, I'll be watching for the divergence on the RSI, maybe a divergence with momentum. If we flip over and look at the MACD, MACD is rolling over. It does have a divergence. It may get one in the more recent price action. But again, to see what happens with the topping tails on the daily charts. Are they confirmed? Do they get a follow through? They just give us a pullback, and then we still go up and try to hit those trend lines in the weekly time frame, in the monthly time frame, longer term levels of resistance on the weekly and monthly charts. Again, I told you, again, we'd likely see a divergence on the RSI. And again, I told you the momentum and the RSI, they were at extremes. And again, the turns up and down have been associated with tops and bottoms. This is going back to the peak right here, whether short-term bottoms like right here, or major tops and bottoms on the intraday charts like here and over here. Turns have signaled signs, except for when we've got the divergences that have formed, like right here and like right here, a divergence formed, but then we corrected sideways. I talked about that triangle at great length and detail. Minute chart, and here in the 60-minute chart, broke out of it with the PPI data, and then the CPI. We've got a gap and go. You always want to watch a gap. Is it a gap and go, gap and fill, or gap and trap? So far, we have a gap and go. Again, if gap support can hold, the trend line holds, you can still go up into the upper range there and form that. And then if we do, we could see a divergence begin to develop, very similar to the bullish divergence here or the bearish divergence over here, or the bearish divergence here that gave us that sell-off there. Things to be paying attention to, but I think we still have a pretty good shot. Even though we get topping tails on the daily time frame, I still think you got a pretty good shot that we're going to hit that upper channel line on the S&P 500 and the Dow. I don't know if we reach it on the NASDAQ. We're pretty far away from it, but we do have NVIDIA earnings next week, so if we try to rally, gives us the final rally, the NASDAQ does reach that upper channel of the rising. And just quickly, here is that divergence on the NASDAQ again that is forming. We already had one divergence form up here, and again we went sideways for 7 weeks. We got an over 8% sell-off. We came back to this support level. When this support level right here breaks, okay, you're going to likely break the trend line, okay, which kind of moves slightly on me there. But again, you break the trend line and you take out this support, that will likely confirm a reversal. Right now you have a possible double top or maybe a head and shoulders in play. It could be a double top that's overthrows, or it could evolve into a larger head and shoulders pattern. We break down and then we back test and you get something like that. So again, I'll be watching. Do we make it up here? Again, we have the NVIDIA earnings. Maybe NVIDIA takes us up to that upper trend line for NASDAQ. Maybe it doesn't reach it. We'll see. Watching to see in the next week or two, maybe a little bit longer, but S&P in 2020, when it moved to new high, it peaked in 2020. We moved to new highs those 2 weeks, and it turned. Same thing in 2022. Higher for 2 weeks, and it reversed that second week. Be the same thing here. No guarantee, but again, this week or going on into the next week or 2 or 3, maybe if it drags out, I'll be looking to see if we hit these levels and turn. I think you could hit them immediately. The diversions form, and then we could turn. Again, NASDAQ peaked before the S&P. S&P went higher in January 2022. We made a lower high in December here, but you still had a divergence mark that top. Still led to reversal. Remember, we ended up selling off, rebounding, and again, there was topping process involved here that took time. It's like we went sideways for 7 weeks. That's why people get complacent, because they don't have any patience. I told you again, or likely, I told you back in October, we are likely going to go up and form a topping process. That topping process can unfold with a lower high, with the higher high. Because the market takes its time doing what it's going to do, again, people will not expect it. Look, I've warned about the lower high scenario, the higher high scenario. I've talked about this rising wedge. I've talked about all these things. I told you the different scenarios in which it could play out. And right now we're getting the higher high diversion scenario with the RSI. I still think you got a shot at reaching that trend line there. And remember, next week is NVIDIA earnings. It's May 22nd. Got the S&P and NASDAQ bouncing off of these trend lines here. Again, I drew this trend line, a parallel boundary to this upper boundary before we ever reached it, because I thought this gap was going to fill, and I told you it could bottom there. That was right where we hit the 20-week moving average. I told you if we did bottom, then we could possibly fill the gap, get a lower high, or go make a new high, form the diversions at the upper channel line in the weekly time frame. That's not this channel. This channel is from the October 2023 low. The channel I'm showing you on the weekly chart is from the October 2022 low, from the bottom there in October of 2022. So again, this channel right here, we bounced off of it before we ever reached it. And again, if we come back down, we take out this trend line. And again, I've talked about the smaller channel within this larger channel from October 2022. And if we end up turning off of the trend line here, or slightly overthrowing it and then turning down off of it though, and coming back down and breaking this trend line, the blue trend line there, then again, eventually we can move back towards the longer term moving averages, the 200, the 400, and this trend line down here near the 4,500 area. That'll probably be higher by the time we reach it. But again, this is the long-term channel, so I think you've got a pretty good shot that we're going to get a reaction off of that trend line, which is also where the trend lines are coming into play from 2000 and 2007 on the weekly and monthly charts. The confluence of resistance there, as I've talked about yesterday. I want to continue to point this out on the S&P weekly chart. This is the NAAIM exposure index. It's money managers. Active money managers' exposure to the market. And again, it's forming a triple divergence, just like it did back over here. I talked about this back up at the top, that if we did come back down, sell off, try to bounce around the 20-week moving average, still may see a divergence develop here. And again, I told you it would look something like this. Well, it looks nearly identical to this. I showed you the topping tail on the Dow. I showed you the topping tail on the S&P. Here's the topping tail on the NASDAQ. Again, could be a short-term topping tail, could be a major top that is completing. Candlesticks mean absolutely nothing unless they get confirmation and a follow-through, and we'd have to see if the signals all begin to turn back to bearish. We'll have the 20 below the 50, the 10 is above it. Again, this is suggesting a top as the moving averages crisscross back and forth. So again, we did get a bearish shooting star on NASDAQ, so I'll be watching to see what happens with this candlestick. Does it mark a peak, or do we pull back, still get one more push higher? Again, NASDAQ filled the gap, moved to a new high above this level. Again, we have a possible rising wedge in play as well here. And again, if we've peaked, maybe it's done, but it could be we just move back here to this support level here. If we get a bigger pullback, bounce off the trend line, or even go back to gap support or try to fill the gap and then rebound back up, and maybe the trend line changes. But it is very possible we still see a confirmation of a lower high or divergence develop on these RSIs, one or the other. Now, maybe we sell off, get a bigger sell off back to the 50 or whatever, back towards the cloud, and then we get a lower high, and that's the end of it. That could play out as well. But again, I expect that a divergence or lower high is likely. I think there's a pretty good chance the Dow's going to get another push up above 40,000 and probably a close above 40,000. If it does, probably the Dow and the S&P are going to slam into those trend lines in the weekly time frame. I don't know if NASDAQ reaches it. Maybe it does. We got NVIDIA earnings next week. Again, I'm watching all of those trend lines closely, and maybe we pull back and it's NVIDIA that takes us up there. Takes the NASDAQ higher and gives us the divergences on the 60-minute chart. Maybe it's NVIDIA earnings next week that does it with S&P and the Dow and the NASDAQ. Said back in January 2022 top and back up to 2020 top, reached the extremes twice. Before the weekend, maybe we just get a more mild pullback. We go up and we form the diversions here. Test the highs next week and end up selling off with NVIDIA earnings. It could play out either way, but again, could see a peak and a reversal surrounding NVIDIA earnings, or peak going into NVIDIA earnings and then the reversal. I'll be watching those weekly trend lines. I'll be watching the topping tails to see what happens with those in the daily time frame. I'll be watching these RSIs in the 60-minute time frame. End up getting a lower high or a divergence. Within striking distance of those upper channel lines on the Dow and on the S&P 500, I think you got a pretty good shot we might reach those levels. Start a reversal with the topping tails. No guarantee we do. I think probability is probably pretty good that we're going to reach the upper channel line on the S&P 500 and Dow.